was on the Eugene Police Department for, I believe, 37 years, 9 years as chief. He's been running the outfit since, I think, 2017, as I recall. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Pete Kearns.
Thank you. Well, it's going to take a little coordination. Is it okay if I move the bell? Yeah. This I'm going to hang on to. This will be handy. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to talk about the disease of addiction, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what the need is in Oregon and in the United States, and the value, and then the value of treatment, both for individuals and families, but also as a public policy matter. And then what the experience is like for people who go into treatment at a place like Soaring Eagle Lane. So first of all, I grew up in Eugene, and large Catholic family with 8 kids, and a family like ours that I knew really well. 6 kids, went to Catholic school and mass every Sunday, and high school, pretty typical family. They had, what was unusual about them though, is that they had a lot of spiritual experiences. I mean, more than I've heard from any other family or individual. And they're just such well-grounded people that it was difficult to hear their stories and not think, wow, that sounds possible. One of my favorites is about one of the sisters who's now retired school teacher. After they had two loving parents. Her dad was a electrical technician, and he was born with a birth defect. His arms, the tips of his fingers went to about here. So his wrists were here, and then his arms were connected at the shoulder. And yet he was the most clever technician, very smart individual, but with all the imperfections in his personality that all of us have. And a beautiful mother who stayed home and raised their children, but who developed Alzheimer's as she grew older, and spent a lot of time in a nursing home, and then eventually passed away. Well, after both of them had died, this one daughter was staying in the family home when they were getting ready to prepare it for sale. And while she was laying in bed one night, a blue orb entered the room and hovered over the bed and moved about, and she realized it was her mother. And she said, "Mom, is that you?" And it moved around, danced around a little bit as if responding to her. And after a little while, another blue orb entered, hovered around the other one. They kind of danced around each other. She asked, "Dad, is that you?" It sort of danced excitedly as if responding also. And she had tears. She described tears running down the side of her face while she was in the room with her parents who had died. And, what she described was that here were her parents without any imperfections, no short arms, no Alzheimer's, but with just the beauty that each of us has within us. Each of us could be reduced to those beautiful characteristics that we possess that are unique to each of them. And that's what she saw there. And when we treat people with alcoholism or drug addiction, that's what's required of the people who care for them, the ability to see past the extraordinarily profound imperfections that a person suffering an addiction has, and be able to be present with them, concentrating on what the gifts are that they bring with it, because that person is dealing with so much self-loathing, which is so unfortunate, because addiction is way beyond the capacity of any single individual to address on their own. There probably are cases where a person could, but some folks are just born with a predisposition to become addicted to a substance. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about what that condition looks like in the human brain. So you probably, if we stop and think about it, each of you could probably tell me what your favorite meal is, or what your favorite food is, your favorite beverage. And it's the kind of thing where when you get to pick up that salty potato chip and put it on your lip, on your tongue, it's just like, that's what I wanted all day long kind of thing. Does everybody have a drink like that, or a meal, or article of food that's like that, you can probably picture it, imagine it in your mind right now, and you're thinking, well, it would be nice to have that. Well, when I think of the chocolate cupcake or the potato chip or what have you, that is the most delicious thing in my life, a little bit of dopamine is released in my brain, my midbrain. And if I pick up that article, that thing, and I taste it, more dopamine is released. It's my brain is reinforcing for me that that's a good thing, that it's okay for me to have that. If I swallow it, when it hits my stomach, a little more dopamine. So just as those of us who have normal levels of dopamine being released in our midbrain, that on a graph, it probably looks like this. And we have our chocolate chip, our chocolate cupcake, a little bit of an increase, and then over time it plays out. Well, that's a reward that the human body gives us to ensure the survival of the species. So if I'm stranded on a desert island and there's no food, and I've been there for a week and haven't eaten anything, and 2 boxes of food wash up, and one of them is cauliflower, and the other one is a box of chocolate cupcakes, my brain's going to tell me to eat the chocolate cupcakes, because the reality is they're going to keep me alive longer than that cauliflower. So there's an actual purpose. The sex drive is rewarded in this way, and all of that. And those things I just mentioned, they just create this little increase. But if we introduce alcohol to the human brain, then that midbrain, there's a little bit more dopamine. We introduce heroin or cocaine or fentanyl, there is this massive deposit of dopamine in the brain that our brains were never designed to endure or to tolerate. So if a person is inclined to become addicted, they'll have their first drink of alcohol, maybe at the age of 10 or 15 or 20. And all of a sudden, for the first time in their lives, they feel normal. They realize this is what normal feels like. And they have more of it and more of it. Some people with an addiction can not drink for months, but when they do start drinking, there's no off switch. They just drink and drink and drink until they black out. Some people, it's a bad habit. They see it as a bad habit that occurs over time, and they drink a little bit at night after work in order to ease their tension, and then more and more and more. And because of that predisposition that they have, that craving for that is very strong. That's what's occurring in the midbrain. Now, in the prefrontal cortex, you've seen images of the brain. It looks like a big shaped pile of macaroni. In the very front part of that cortex is something known as the prefrontal cortex, and that's where our judgment resides. So we have a lifetime of experiences where we learn from one another on the playground about right and wrong. We learn from our teachers, our coaches, our parents about right and wrong. We're corrected when we do something we shouldn't do. We're rewarded when we do something right. We may have a spiritual belief system that informs our judgment in the prefrontal cortex. And after a while, as adults, we use that to make sound decisions that help us exist well in our families and in our work and in our society. But what will happen when a person has an addiction is, when I want that cupcake and I'm on a diet and I decide I'm only going to have 1 cupcake a week, but one's in front of me every day, that prefrontal cortex enables me to make a decision about whether I should eat that. That prefrontal cortex can be more powerful than the desire for the cupcake. But with cocaine or fentanyl or methamphetamine or an abuse of alcohol, the prefrontal cortex doesn't stand a chance against that. And so if you know somebody who suffered from an addiction, and I've had relatives who've died from their addiction to alcohol, you think, why don't you just get your act together? It just seems like a character problem. It's misrepresented by behavior as a character flaw, when really it isn't. The brain has transformed into this enormous desire, craving for whatever the drug is that this person is addicted to. And that prefrontal cortex doesn't stand a chance. Lie, manipulate, steal, what have you. So that's the disease that we're dealing with. And in order to care for people who suffer from this, it requires this recognition that a condition now exists in this person's brain, and they need the time and tools to learn how to strengthen that prefrontal cortex, rest the midbrain so it can recover from this onslaught dopamine. So that's how the disease of addiction happens. And some people, they're born with a very small distribution of dopamine in the brain. We don't know why, but some people have less, some people have more. They're born with more. For the people with less, that's a person who just feels icky, kind of depressed, never really feels good about themselves or others or their place in the world. And then they'll take something that releases that dopamine. Could be food, but if it's a substance like alcohol, it releases it, and that's why suddenly they feel normal. So you might, if you know somebody with an addiction, sometimes they'll tell you that when I used meth, I was addicted from the first moment. The first time I used it, I was a meth addict. 75% of the people who use methamphetamine never become addicted to it. So it has so much to do with the person's physical, biological predisposition. The need for treatment in the United States is actually pretty great. About 106,000 Americans die from a drug overdose every year since the beginning of the pandemic. Before the pandemic, it was more like 75,000 a year. Now it's over 100,000 a year. That's 300 Americans that die every day. I was talking with one of my former colleagues the other day at the Eugene Police Department, and while I was on the phone with him, he was logging 50,000 hits of fentanyl into the evidence locker they just found in a car stop that afternoon. And he said it's so much different here now. He said that he said here's what's different. When you and I were young patrol officers and said 40 of us would be sitting in a room like the one that we're all in here right now, and they'd ask, how many of you have administered CPR on the street? And a few of us might raise our hands. He says, you ask that question of 40 cops now, everybody raises their hand. That's how bad the fentanyl epidemic is today. People are dying. Americans are dying every day here in Portland, for sure. Almost 40 and a half Americans suffer from substance use disorder. And it's about 10% of any population. Oregon gathers these statistics pretty well in self-report surveys. And so we know exactly how high we're higher than most states. We have a higher reported rate than most states, and we have less availability to treatment than most states. But it might be easy to think of this, it would be a mistake, but it would be really easy to think of this as a homelessness problem. So LA, for instance, has 3.9 million people living in LA. 70,000 of the people who live in LA are homeless. And if even every single one of those homeless people had an alcohol or drug addiction, that's not the 10%. You know, it's 390,000 people in LA would have an addiction. The people who are homeless is just a small percentage of them. That's the demographic, the people in the rest of society, not just the homeless, but in the rest of society that Serenity Lane treats. In Portland, there's 653,000 people roughly that live here. 5,000 people live on the street, according to the most recent homeless count. It's probably much higher than that. But 10% of the Portland population is 65,000. So those are the people with homes and jobs and families. Those are the people that we want to treat, that we want to treat. It's not all the people that need treatment, because the enormous value in treating the people, a person with a home, a family, children, spouse, is that those children are going to have children too. And there'll be another generation of children. And the better that parent can be in recovery from their addiction, the better that the generation that they're raising, the following generation will be. So that's why we target that. And the disease doesn't care. It doesn't care if I'm a Republican or if I'm a Democrat, if I live in rural Oregon or urban centers. It doesn't care whether I'm a man or a woman. 10% of any population generally is going to develop the substance use disorder. And it represents an enormous economic loss to the United States, about $20 trillion a year. So the value of treatment is that it inverts this equation where really typical story that police departments see is that there will be someone who is a successful collegiate athlete, or they're running their own business. And this was very common at the beginning of the opioid epidemic. And they'd have a surgery, or they'd be recovering from an injury, and they'd need a pain medication. And if they're a member of that small minority, those people who have a predisposition to addiction, they get that painkiller, and all of a sudden they're addicted to it very quickly. So this isn't just the body's dependence. I mean, that a biological dependence, we could all experience that. You know, if I have to take a pain med with no history and likely no future of addiction, but if I take that pain med over and over and over throughout the day for 30 or 40 days, my body is going to become dependent on that, and I'll need to be weaned off of it, and it's going to be uncomfortable, but it's not an addiction. It's a biological dependence. This addiction is very different from that. This is a person who, when they don't have it, it's all they think about. When they're in bed in the middle of the night and they're craving it, they're sweating, their heart is pounding, they will do nothing else in life except to have this thing, whatever that substance is. And they'll go out and rob the 7-Eleven, or they'll do whatever it takes in order to have that. So what we would see, what police departments see, is that person with a job and a family will become addicted to this substance. And there's only so long that the medical community will prescribe it to them. And so they'll move to an illicit, illegal drug that they can buy on the street. And you can't buy that with a credit card or with a prescription. So they need cash, and often, and when their business goes south and they lose their job, the only place to get cash is to start stealing or forging or what have you. They commit a few crimes, and pretty soon the police department is locking up people who not long ago had jobs or businesses and careers and families and so on, and now they're on their way to prison. And unfortunately, the Oregon State prison system has people in there, collegiate athletes, business owners, who have had this experience. So the value, the public policy value, is that we invert that. We can interrupt that person while they still have, we can intervene in their life when they still have the family, the job, or they've recently had their family or their job. And then instead of the society paying for their hospital bed, paying for their jail bed, paying for their prison bed, paying for the cost of the criminal process, the medical, it goes on and on. Instead, I'm now a contributing member of society, and I'm raising children who are going to have children. I'm caring for my spouse. I've got a healthy environment, and the impact of that, the benefit of that to society is beyond what any of us can measure, but we know it's good. So Serenity Lane's history, try and keep track of my time. Serenity Lane is one of quite a number of very unique treatment facilities across the country. It's among those treatment facilities that are like it. The story is pretty similar. And in our case, the story starts with my dad. I've got 7 siblings, so it's always weird. If you come from a big family, you know, it's kind of weird to say my dad when it's really ours. You belong to this whole community of siblings. But our dad was born into a beautiful little family in a tiny town in Nebraska, Scottsbluff, Nebraska. And mom, 2 brothers, and his dad was a dentist, the only dentist in town. There was only one doctor, probably only one, you name it, there's one of each. And his dad was an alcoholic. So as he grew older, loved his dad, admired him and respected him greatly, and was uncomfortable, with his drinking, and was embarrassed by it when friends came over for dinner, that kind of thing. And at a pretty young age, his mom and his 2 brothers died from diseases that they would survive today. So it's just Tom and his dad. And then his dad got in a horrible traffic crash while out drinking one night, bad injuries, convalesced on the couch in the living room, continued to drink, and then died from his alcoholism. So now this, 13 or 14-year-old kid is all alone, had the most beautiful family any of us could hope for, and now he's alone. And his close relatives sent him to a boarding school, Catholic boarding school. And while there, pretty despondent and grieving deeply, he went to the grotto. Grotto was a shrine for the Blessed Virgin Mary. And I always get a little choked up here, so I hope I want to bear, you'd have to remember not to tell my wife about this if you ever see her. Anyway, so he prays to the Blessed Virgin Mary and asks to know and do God's will, and doesn't ask for a new bicycle, doesn't ask that his family can be brought back to him, doesn't ask for something from me. He asks to know the right thing to do so that he can do it. This is just a 14-year-old kid. So he completes high school. He goes to Creighton University, finishes that early, goes to medical school there, finishes that a little bit after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So on that day in 1941, he and his classmates went down to the recruitment center and signed up, and they accelerated their medical education, which is a little worrisome, but they did. And he went into the Navy, ended up on a destroyer in the South Pacific, and somebody there recommended that he move to Grants Pass, Oregon. So mom and 3 kids ended up in Grants Pass, and wasn't big enough. Portland, they thought, was going to be too big for them, so they moved to Eugene. And pretty innovative couple of people. He had a private family practice, delivered babies and reset broken arms. And when he realized nobody was treating obesity, he treated people with obesity, figured out how to care for people with obesity. There was no preschool care or no preschool education in Eugene at that time. So they started a Eugene Montessori school, which still exists today. When he realized that he wanted to use his experience to care for the alcoholic, he traveled around the country, visited a number of places, and created, and based on what he learned, got $10,001 donation from George Weyerhaeuser, and used that to buy a fraternity right next to the U of O campus. And they converted that into a treatment facility. And in fact, there's a criminal defense attorney who really a cool guy who's a recovering alcoholic, who went to University of Oregon and belonged to that fraternity, drank there heavily, didn't realize he was an alcoholic till he got into private practice and realized he has a problem. Looked around to see where the best treatment was, and it was Serenity Lane, in the same fraternity where he lived when he was in college. And so now he helps get people into treatment. So we were in that fraternity house for a long time, and then we built this beautiful campus in Coburg, and so that's where our headquarters and where our residential treatment is now. So the treatment experience that somebody's going to have, check the time here, and I've got till about 12:30 roughly. Okay. So what happens for someone who has an addiction is, a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, a lot of self-loathing, and eventually they get into that place in their life where they realize, I have got to deal with this. And so they'll call a place like Serenity Lane, and we answer the phone and we ask them what their issue is. And after just a few questions, a admissions counselor or an assessment counselor has a pretty good idea. Is this a person that needs to go into residential care, or is this a person who could be treated in outpatient care? And if they go to outpatient care, then we'll do an assessment on the phone to understand what their addiction history is, and then we'll introduce them to their counselor in one of our outpatient facilities. They'll show up there, and they'll probably attend what's known as an intensive outpatient care for about 10 weeks. That's 3 visits a week. They work in a process group. The clients who are involved get to know each other pretty well. They bubble up the things in their lives that they feel contribute to their addiction, and together they work through those things. A person who owns their own business will be in a group with someone who is a laborer, and you think normally in life they wouldn't have anything in common. They have so much in common with their addiction. There's so many typical factors in that they can relate like they're brothers. If someone has a more serious condition, then we would prescribe them to go into inpatient care, and we have a hospital in this new facility, so they'll spend about 4 days there in withdrawal management. Withdrawal management for someone with methamphetamine addiction is really just a lot of sleep, and they may sleep almost constantly for 4 days. Someone with an opioid addiction, then we have different doses, small amounts of drugs that will help to ease the withdrawal from that, so that they don't have this horrible craving and they stand up and leave. And they may continue to be on that drug that both blocks the receptors for the opioid, but has just enough of the drug so that they don't crave and they can enjoy the benefits of treatment before they leave. And some of those folks might get on long-term medication assisted treatment, which could be in the form of a pill, or it might be a monthly shot they have, just like insulin. This eliminates the cravings, enables them to live a normal life and to participate in their treatment. But eventually they'll leave the hospital, they'll go over to the residential program where we have dormitories, and they'll participate. It's a very busy day that starts at 6 a.m. and doesn't end until 9 o'clock at night, with process groups and mental health care, psychiatrists, medical practitioners on campus. And it's constant process of digging into what it is that contributes so substantially to my drinking, so that middle brain that's had years and years and years of overdosages of things that release dopamine has a chance to rest, so that prefrontal cortex can start to redevelop through meditation and spirituality and learning some skills about how to deal with those cravings when they occur, getting back to a place where they're conforming to their values and right and wrong and you name it. And then they graduate from that and they go into the outpatient services, either with us or with somebody else. And in time, about half the people, according to the National Institutes of Health, about half the people who go through that treatment that I just described will relapse. And relapse, it turns out, is part of recovery. They may relapse once or twice, but as long as they keep working on it, they get into AA or something like it. They belong to a community of people who are working on recovery. They serve other people in recovery. Then there is the possibility for freeing themselves from that daily addiction. So that's why we do what we do. And I'm so glad you're patient enough to hear the story. I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes.
Yeah.
For just a sec.
It sounds to me like you're saying at least that the addiction part of it, there's a physical, maybe genetic thing. Is there a way to test for that so that, I might find out if my daughter has a predisposition for that and warn her about that or something like that?
Yeah, there might be a blood test, that can be done that would identify some indicators there. When I go to the doctor, they ask, does anybody in your family history have cancer? Had cancer? Can you describe it? Anybody in your history had heart problems? Anybody had, that has all these potential hereditary medical maladies? Nobody has ever asked me, has anybody ever suffered from depression? Anybody ever suffered from suicidal ideation? Anybody ever suffered from addiction? Those are probably the best indicators. And then we also have know in the science of all this that people with an addiction more often than not have significant adverse childhood experiences. And there is a measure of that each of us, a test that each of us could take to know what that is. So it's probably a combination of those, that kind of data that would help to know. Yeah. Yes.
So it all sounds pretty comprehensive and useful for the public and people who need it. When you think about that, it also does not sound inexpensive. So I'm sure you take private insurance. Would something like Medicare or Medicaid cover it? Or if someone didn't have insurance, would people be able to afford it? If I was paying out of pocket?
Yeah. Well, and it's, there's a pretty narrow percentage of the population that doesn't have some kind of insurance. Most of us either have commercial or Medicare, or if we're at a certain place above the poverty level, we'll be eligible for Medicaid in Oregon. Oregon has a lot of access, more than most states, to Medicaid. Serenity Lane, about half of our patients have commercial insurance. Half have Medicaid. We don't do Medicare because it's so difficult to work with. And Medicaid, it is expensive to do what we do because unlike most places, we have a psychiatrist, we have 2 full-time medical doctors and contract doctors, nurse practitioners, 3 psychologists. We have licensed mental health practitioners, and then the alcohol and drug counselors. That's a pretty high level of professional services that most places don't have. So in order to provide that, is expensive. An even smaller number of people that we take on, so about half are Medicaid, half are commercial, and then a very narrow percentage pay privately. Their insurance doesn't cover, so they're in a different network. Their insurance doesn't cover us, so they'll pay the whole thing. At Serenity Lane, that's our shelf rate, if you know that term. It could cost a person who pays cash somewhere between $20,000 and $25,000. And then there's another place in Oregon that's $45,000, exceptional care. Most of the treatment facilities in Oregon primarily serve Medicaid, and probably 30 days of treatment there would be $15,000 or so. Does that answer your question?
I was curious to know, is there a certain age that someone could call in? And then also, oh, I just forgot it. So maybe I'll ask you after.
Yeah.
What if the person is a minor, and then what if, do they all have to be self-referred, or can a family member call in of concerns and then you reach out to them?
Yeah, most of us only treat adults, so that's 18 or older. I don't actually know what treatment facilities are available for youth. They're totally inadequate. I visited a place in Nashville that's very similar history to Serenity Lane, and they have a juvenile treatment facility there. One for boys and one location, totally different location, one for girls. And that's really uncommon in Tennessee also. Oregon does have a recovery high school. Lake Oswego has a recovery high school. So the most dangerous time for children in high school is between 3P and 6P, you know. So this recovery high school provides a place where kids who are working at staying in recovery, a safe place to be, to work on their recovery all the way through until mom and dad can pick them up. So that's available. And I'm trying to remember the director of the Department of Education, Colt Gill, wants these to be in every county in Oregon. So the legislature is coming up with ways to fund it. And then your other question was, oh yeah, everybody who comes into Serenity Lanes and just about every treatment facility is asking to be there. So there, you've probably heard about interventions. There are professional interventionists throughout the country, a dozen or so that work in Oregon. The family gets together and says, okay, Bob, this is enough. It's time to get into treatment. Well, if that person decides in that moment, yeah, I definitely need it. I want to be there. They're highly motivated. There's a good chance that they'll succeed in treatment. But if they say, I'm just doing this because my wife is making me, she's going to leave me if I don't, there's a little less likelihood they'll succeed, but we'll take them and give them that opportunity. And sometimes their motivation changes while they're with us.
How many people do you treat?
You're ahead of yourself. I'm sorry. I need to get my.
That's okay.
Since it sounds like the original issue with a lot of these patients are either the dopamine or the dopaminergic receptors, is there any research being done actually to do any manipulation or anything on that level to try to go right back to where it all starts so that they wouldn't have relapse?
Yeah, probably. I mean, the medication assisted treatment does help to address that. So that the injections that someone would receive. There's also an injection that's used for people with alcohol addiction, Vivitrol. Not many people want to use it because I guess the shot is pretty uncomfortable. But they get that once a month and it works for some people and doesn't for others. So I imagine there's a lot of pharmaceutical and mechanical, electronics. Some people, there has been experiments with probes like those that are installed in the brain of somebody who has epilepsy that will help to address the electronic signals that will lead to that. So there's been some experimentation with that. And then I think the future is probably going to involve psilocybin and LSD.
My question is related to Eugene adopted Cheers for street response. Mechanisms.
Yeah.
Yeah, cahoots, that's it. Yeah, I'm thinking of our Cheers service here but anyway, are you a referral agency or a place where they will, when they're called, if they can transport someone for temporary housing and treatment? Do you receive anything like that? We've adopted a model here just recently.
Yeah, we don't because we want to assess people before they show up at our facility. We want to make sure we're the right place for them because there's nothing more, demoralizing to someone who's decided they needed care. They get on site and then we realize they're at the wrong place, But Eugene has an intake facility anybody can go into off the street, and that's where Cahoots transports them.
So, what do you do to prepare the families to receive the people who are coming out of your care? My brother-in-law went through care at Serenity by the Sea and had a very short, relapse very quickly. And we really were never, he was living with us at the time, and we were really never counseled, well, what do we do now? So what do you do to kind of help those families?
Right. Well, it's harder with the pandemic, because the facility has to be secure from that. But what we do is we involve the family immediately when somebody gets into care, and their primary counselor, the person who's in treatment, and their family work together. And we do that because, that family unit, even if it's dysfunctional, that dysfunction likes it that way, without going into a lot of detail. And you subtract one person, the dysfunction gets wobbly, you put it back in, it goes right back to its dysfunction because it likes that. So when someone goes into treatment, they do a lot of work on themselves. The family unit needs to learn, okay, what do we modify so that when this person comes back, they're less likely to relapse. And so that work is done throughout their residential treatment and throughout their outpatient treatment. It's clunkier now because it's on Zoom and conference call, but it is critical.
Back to our distinguished president.
All right. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you.